Hello and welcome to episode 2 of our series on Max Aitken, Lord Beaverbrook. My name is Thomas Daly from Character Matters, Miramichi. Now in episode 1 we explored Max's early life here at historic Beaverbrook House. Today in episode 2 we are going to take a look at his time in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, alongside his good friend R.B. Bennett, and his eventual move across the globe to London, England. So follow me. In 1897, the two men arrived and quickly made a name for themselves in Calgary business and politics by running a bowling alley? A bowling alley. I'm serious, that was their first dealings in business together. The always ballsy Max must have been quite the bowler. He bragged in his writings about how he challenged customers, stating that if they could beat him, they would get a free game. But if they lost, pay up. Unlike a stuffy office, this bowling alley was no doubt more relaxed, a place where they could court business and political partners. It's fair to guess that over some casual drinks, any number of deals were made at this bowling alley. In 1898, Max Aitken managed another successful political campaign for R.B. Bennett, this time helping him secure a seat in the Legislative Assembly of the Northwest Territories, which Alberta was part of at the time. It was apparent that Aitken had a gift for negotiating and deal-making. He was very successful at selling insurance. People were willing to put their faith and their money behind this magnetic young man. He always seemed to befriend and impress the right people at the right time. Upon moving to Halifax, Nova Scotia, Max Aitken met John Stairs, a wealthy financier, who hired him in 1902 and trained him in the world of finance. Even though Aitken had very little formal schooling, he became general manager of the Stairs Royal Securities Corporation in 1904, the first investment firm in Eastern Canada. Stairs passed away later that year in Toronto. Max Aitken was at his mentor's bedside when he died. He must have certainly made an impact in that short time because Stairs left Aitken in control of the entire company. Max Aitken married his wife Gladys in 1906, with whom he had 3 children. They moved to Montreal, which was the financial center of Canada at the time. Here, Aitken acquired a seat on the Montreal Stock Exchange and was well on his way to becoming a millionaire by the age of 30. That's an impressive amount of money by today's standards, let alone in the early 1900s. It's actually the equivalent of, let me check here. $34,082,888 in 2024, thanks to the trusty inflation calculator. Now, after earning that much money, most people, they would stop and relax. That's more than enough money to last a lifetime and ensure that his family would be well looked after. Instead, Max barreled ahead relentlessly. Within a few years, through wheeling and dealing, acquisitions and mergers, he created the Steel Company of Canada, the Canada Cement Company, and held large controlling interest in banks, transport, steel, coal, hydroelectric industries, making himself a multi-millionaire. I wonder how many of those teachers at Harkin's Academy made that much money. It has been said that Canada is a nation of hewers of wood and drawers of water. And that was especially true at that time. The big money was in our natural resources. But Max still had a love for the media. And by now, he had lived all across Canada. Oh, it was time for the boy who was called a dreamer to dream bigger than ever. And in 1910, he set his sights on a new challenge, the most influential city in the world, London. No, not that one, not the one in Ontario, the real one. Now, I have been to 10 or more European capitals, and I have to say that London ranks near the very top of that list. It's so big and grand and historic and modern, a bastion of arts and entertainment. It is a city that one could easily be overwhelmed by, perhaps step back, question their ability. But that was not the case for Max Aitken. He propelled himself into London's social life. He used his wealth and influence to rub elbows with powerful people, one of which was Bonner Law, a fellow New Brunswicker from the tiny town of Rexton, who had been making quite a name for himself in British politics. Bonner Law and Max Aitken had a lot in common. They were both successful in business. Both had fathers who were ministers. Both had similar conservative political beliefs. Less than a year after he moved to London, Max Aitken won a seat in Parliament, and the following year, 1911, he was knighted Sir Maxwell Aitken at the age of just 32. Max Aitken was now entering a very elite circle, the British aristocracy. It would be an entirely new challenge for Max. When he spoke in Parliament, he was accused of sounding too colonial. His common-class Miramichi dialect made him sound uneducated to the private school-educated, high-society people surrounding him. He was new money. They were old money. But what Max lacked in fancy degrees and privileged pedigree, he made up for with a force of personality. The historian Neil Asherson had this to say about Max Aitken. The first is that posh English society was no match for him. He was vulgar. But there was a charm in his self-promotion which made languid ladies and gentlemen want to be on his side and at his side. He was wildly rich even then, and knew how to use his wealth in hospitality and discreetly by rescuing grand friends from awkward debts. Above all, he was fun to be with. Okay, so there is a lot to unpack there. Languid, what does that even mean? Well, I had to use a dictionary to see for myself. So, languid, let's see. Okay, here it is. Delicate, weak, listless, apathetic, faint, indifferent, weary, lazy, fatigued, and drooping. Now, if I was a woman of that time, I would certainly feel all of those things if I was around a guy who used a word like languid. But Max Aitken, that was somebody who spoke genuinely and without pretension. He was the life of the party, and he was generous. You never had to bring your own bottle or split the bill if you were with Max Aitken, shall we say. And what of these grand friends and awkward debts? Well, it just so happened that these 8th and 10th generation dukes and earls weren't nearly as rich as the public thought they were. More of that old money was going out than coming in, and they weren't actually smart enough to know how to make money in this changing world. So it was Max Aitken that they came to look for a handout, which bought their loyalty for life. Max knew they would mark an X by his name whenever they saw it on the ballot. Max continued doing business in Canada and entered the British markets by buying shares in the popular British car company Rolls-Royce. But it was in newspapers that he was about to make his fortune. He secretly invested £25,000 in a failing newspaper called The Daily Express, and a few years later bought it out completely. He revitalized it, made it appealing to the common people. It contained gossip, celebrity columns, sports results, special features aimed at women, and was the first newspaper in Britain to include crossword puzzles. That newspaper is still running today and is very much alive and well in the digital age. Not a guy to be satisfied with just one newspaper, Max Aitken wanted more. He attempted to buy the Evening Standard but was blocked and would have to wait until 1923 before he could get his hands on that. But he did manage to gain control over another evening newspaper, one called The Globe. So now he had the Daily Express, which came out in the morning, and the Globe, which came out in the evening. Whether you liked your news first thing in the morning or before bed, Sir Max Aitken had you covered. In 1914, the First World War broke out. This devastating global conflict saw more than 650,000 Canadians make their way across the Atlantic to fight in Europe. More than 66,000 were killed and over 172,000 were wounded. With so much death and destruction, it could be easy to become despondent. That's where Sir Max Aitken and his newspapers came in. In 1916, he created the War Records Office to promote the achievements of Canadian forces. He began printing uplifting stories from the front lines, praising their bravery and many victories. In fact, he focused so much attention on the Canadians that Americans reading the newspapers thought only the Canadians were doing the fighting. That did not sit so well with the British powers. They wanted to see more emphasis put on Britain. So they approached Max and talked to him about the issue. But his response was they should buy their own newspaper, just like he did. Max Aitken was ruffling a lot of feathers in Britain, perhaps none more so than the Prime Minister at the time, Herbert Henry Asquith. Aitken felt Asquith was mismanaging the war effort and was vocal in his opinion. When Bonner Law attempted to secure the Distinguished Order of St. Michael and St. George for his friend as a thank you for his service in the war effort in the British Empire, Asquith blocked it. Oh, the gloves were officially off at that point. Max doubled down on his criticisms. He used his media power to highlight Asquith's failures. And in December of 1916, right in the very middle of World War I, Asquith was forced out of office. David Lloyd George replaced him. A slight improvement, but still not the man Aitken wanted in charge. He wanted his friend Bonner Law in the position. But David Lloyd George likely saw what happened with Asquith, so he decided to play it nice and offered Sir Max Aitken an elevation to the peerage. And what does that mean? It means that on January the 23rd, 1917, Sir Max Aitken officially became Lord Beaverbrook. Beaverbrook, the first Lord Beaverbrook. A title not inherited, a title created entirely for him. The story goes that he was considering Lord Miramichi after the river here in his hometown, but historian and good friend Louise Manny recommended something else. She said that people probably would not even be able to pronounce Miramichi, and, well, she was probably right. So, thinking back to his childhood and the little community outside of Newcastle that he used to like to skip school and escape to and go fishing, he chose Beaverbrook. Also, Beaverbrook has a very distinctive Canadian charm to it, doesn't it? Who doesn't love a beaver? But it turned out Lord Beaverbrook wasn't any more accepted than Sir Max Aitken was. If anything, it created more jealousy amongst the establishment. Not only did the Liberal Prime Minister David Lloyd George distrust him, many in his own Conservative Party did as well. They argued that a multi-millionaire press baron should not be employed by the state. All the while, they likely thought, how dare this Canadian come over here and become so successful without our permission? By October of 1918, with World War I almost over, Lord Beaverbrook resigned from politics to focus on his health and more fun things like his media empire. Lord Beaverbrook embraced new technology. He bought state-of-the-art presses to print his papers on, making sure that the articles appeared clearer and the pictures crisper than that of the competition. If he was alive today, it's safe to say he would be on every form of social media there is, complete with a blue check mark. He was relentless and watchful of what was being written, so much so that he had phones installed in every room in his house, so he could call up his newspaper reporters and tell them what stories he wanted reported on and how. Now, free from Parliament, he could launch attacks on whoever he wished, and it was time to take out David Lloyd George and finally give Bonner Law his shot at the Prime Minister's office. After 3 years of machine gun condemnation, David Lloyd George lost his job to Bonner Law, who is the only man in history to be the Prime Minister of Britain without actually being born there. Pretty neat fact. It was becoming clear that Lord Beaverbrook was not a party hack. He was his own man. Politically, he disagreed many times with those closest to him. For example, Rudyard Kipling was a close friend and godfather to one of Max's children. Rudyard Kipling was also the poet of empire. He disagreed with Irish Home Rule. Beaverbrook endorsed Irish Home Rule, an unpopular opinion by many traditionalists in Britain at the time. He opposed British involvement in the Russian Civil War, saying it was no business to Britain who ruled Russia, something he fiercely disagreed with and argued with his close friend Winston Churchill over. He spent close to 15 years attacking his Conservative Party and Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin in the press, and it's said that he privately rejoiced when the Labour Party was victorious. And back in Canada, he even clashed with the Prime Minister, his early friend R.B. Bennett, over something called Empire Free Trade. In 1936, the British Crown faced a crisis when King Edward VIII announced plans to marry the twice-divorced Wallis Simpson. Lord Beaverbrook was one of the first to rally to the king's side, saying he should be able to marry whoever he wishes. Now, Wallis Simpson was a controversial figure. She was an American socialite who did not particularly like living in Britain. Sound familiar? She thought very highly of herself and made brash comments like, "You can never be too rich or too thin." What is interesting in his book, The Beaverbrook suggests that there was a plot to remove King Edward VIII from the throne using a false morality. The culprits included Stanley Baldwin, who didn't like the man, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, who didn't like the marriage. Beaverbrook suggests Baldwin was threatened by the king, who he saw as a reformer, too modern, and would ultimately be more popular than him. The Archbishop was keeping a keen eye on the king's church attendance, and well, it wasn't great. Besides, as the head of the Church of England, the king should at least appear pious on the surface. Beaverbrook claimed he advised Edward VIII to wait until after the coronation and push his marriage through with the power of the throne behind it. But that was a move too bold, even for a king. Edward VIII became Edward the Abdicator. So Max Aitken has taken on the British establishment and became a British lord in the process. Now, between the war on the battlefield and the war in the newspapers, things were pretty wild. But things are just getting started. Because in Germany, an infamous guy with a mustache has just ascended to power. Join us next time for episode 3, and we will talk about how Lord Beaverbrook may have saved democracy as we know it.